This is the first type of rib. It's more narrow than the rest of the fabric because it's gathering, it collects the knitted fabric. And this rib is functional. It has to hold the sock on the ankle, so it's bouncy. And this is another type of rib that is the theme of this video. It's a non-gathering rib, so it is not very bouncy. It does not gather the fabric of the sleeve and continues as a straight line. And the same here. This is the rib of the bottom of the sweater that I was making, and it's also not bouncy, it is straight, non-gathering, and it continues, especially it's visible at the sides, it continues straight. So I made a straight and non-gathering rib for my sweater because I decided that it worked very well and matched the straight edge of the bottom of the jacket that I would wear it with, and also the straight edges of my jeans and the stripy design of this nice self-striping yarn. The horizontal lines match the horizontal straight ribbing. The sweater is worked top down. This is the cast on edge. I used the Italian casting on method, and this allowed to have a very elastic, very stretchy edge of the collar of my sweater, so my head can go through easily and it wraps nicely around my face. And then the sweater was worked all the way down, and I finished it with the rib that looks straight and has a very nice drape. It looks very smooth and just continues as a straight decorative element. And also the stitches of the body of the sweater flow smoothly into the stitches of the rib. There are no baggy stitches. And I used the same methods and techniques for the cuffs of the sleeves. Another important detail to make it look as neat as possible was the invisible ribbed bind-off method, because it matches very well the Italian cast on and it prevents the bottom of the sweater and the cuffs from flaring. This is the gauge of the rib. It's 29 stitches in 10 centimeters, and the gauge of the stockinette was 22 stitches in 10 centimeters. So to make it work, I had to add a few stitches to the ribbing. And this is how I did it. 29 stitches of the rib minus 22 stitches of the body of the sweater, that's extra 7 stitches. So I had to add 7 stitches for every 10 centimeters. I take the 22 stitches of the stockinette and divide it by 7. And that equals 3, which means I have to add an extra stitch after every 3 stitches when I switch to the ribbing. The body of the sweater was worked with a 4mm needle or US 6, and then the preparatory round I worked using a 2.75mm needle or US 2, and this is the same size of the needle that I will later use for the rib. First, I will change the position of the marker of the beginning of the round because it will be easier for me to show what I'm doing in this video. So I'll just move it a little bit lower. It will be easier to see my knitting. So I'm changing from a 4mm needle to a 2.75mm. I knit one stitch, little bit tighten at the changeover point, knit another stitch, and move the old needle out of the way. And I'm going to make my first increase because besides the changing of the needle size, this is the next important step to make a very neat looking rib. So I knit through the front of the stitch and then I knit through the back loop of the same stitch. It's also called KFB. Knit through the front and back of the same stitch. So here I have one knit stitch, another knit stitch, and a knit stitch with an increase. And I will repeat one knit stitch, a second knit stitch, and again an increase. So I knit through the front and through the back of the same stitch, or KFB. Again I have two knit stitches and one knit stitch and one increase, or one KFB. And I continue the same way. One knit stitch, another knit stitch, and KFB. Knit through the front and through the back of the same stitch. So two knit stitches, one KFB, two knit stitches, one KFB, two knit stitches, one KFB, and so on. And it's very important to note that the frequency of the increases as well as the needle sizes were determined by the experimentation with the swatching, so I was not guessing. This is the end of the preparatory round, and I have here one knit stitch, another knit stitch, and KFB. Again, one knit stitch, another knit stitch, KFB. And it flows very well into the beginning of the round. Two knit stitches, KFB, two knit stitches, KFB. Another advantage of this method is that the KFB increase looks like a purl bump. So I'll have a purl stitch here, then a knit stitch here, purl stitch here, and another knit stitch here. That's the plan. Next part is the actual rib. I continue using the 2.75mm needle. My first stitch is a knit stitch, then just as I planned, a purl stitch, then again a knit stitch because it's a one knit one purl rib, and a purl stitch right above the bump of the KFB increase. Again a knit stitch, a purl stitch, another knit stitch, and again a purl stitch right above another bump of the KFB increase, and continue knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, and purl stitch. And this is how it looks. My round starts with a knit stitch, then there is a purl stitch, knit stitch, and another purl stitch right above the bump of the KFB increase. Again, knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, and another purl stitch above the bump of the cave bean crease. And this looks very natural and organic, if we can say so about the ribbing, and it's less visible than any other method of increasing. Also, I think it's worth noticing that I changed the beginning of the round, so it would follow the center of the underarm. This is the imaginary side seam of the sweater, because it's the least visible area to make any kinds of changes. And here I'm finishing my first round of the ribbing, last few stitches. That's it, I'm done. This is already the beginning of the round, and I want to show how it looks. So I've completed the first round of ribbing, and here I've completed a couple of rounds and a few more rounds. And I did exact same thing for the cuffs of my sleeves, so it worked for both the cuffs of the sleeves and the bottom of the sweater. And after washing, it will straighten and look like this. Here I finished binding off the cuffs of the sleeves. This is the look. And I am finishing binding off the bottom ribbing of the sweater. So I've done so far this much. This is how the edge looks. This is my leftover of the yarn tail. I will still need it to finish the binding off. And this is how much I have left, how many stitches I have left to finish binding. I have a full video about this method, so please follow the link if you want to see a very detailed step-by-step video about this. But in this video I wanted to include just a couple of steps because it shows how I handle a super long yarn tail when I bind off the very long line of stitches. So I leave my needle usually to rest somewhere in front of me. I just stick it in the sweater. The stitches are very easy to see. This is a very beautiful yarn, pleasure to work with. And I repeat, I leave my tapestry needle somewhere in front of me, usually stuck into the stitches of the sweater, and just gently pull the yarn tail through the stitches, making sure that it doesn't tangle anywhere. I was asked to show what I do at the end of the round, and I decided to include this portion in the video. So this is not a tutorial, but rather a documentary. So here are my last few stitches. I just bound together 2 knit stitches, and I'm going to work 2 purls. They look just like knit stitches at the back. I stick my tapestry needle somewhere into the sweater, pull my yarn tail through, just a little bit tighten. And now I have to bind 2 knit stitches. And I have an obstacle. I have this marker here, so I'll go through the first knit stitch, and then I need to slip off my purl stitch so I can remove the marker. Then I return that purl stitch back onto the left needle tip and finish binding 2 knit stitches. Again, leave my needle to rest somewhere in front of me. I'll just stick it into the sweater. Carefully pull the yarn tail through. Move the yarn tail to the right, just for convenience, and bind off 2 purl stitches. Again, pull the yarn tail through, stick the needle into the sweater in front of me, make sure I don't tangle anything. Now I can remove my circular needle. I will not need it anymore. And these are the very last stitches. So this is the last knit stitch. I go in, front to back, and back to front into the knit stitch on the left, like this, and pull the yarn tail through. Leave my needle to rest and make sure I don't tangle the yarn tail. Okay, and I have to now join the last 2 purl stitches. They look like knit stitches at the back, so that's the first purl stitch, and the next one is to the left. I'll just check the position. So that's my last knit stitch, and right behind it there is a stitch that looks like a knit stitch but at the back. So that's the last purl stitch. Again, I leave my needle to rest, pull the yarn tail through, and this is it. I'm finished with my super long edge. And I was also asked to show what I do with the yarn tail. So this is what I do. I'm going to move it just 1 stitch up from the edge, like this. And to weave in the yarn tail, I prefer to leave about 15-20 centimeters of the length, or somewhere between 6 and 8 inches. My yarn tail is of a bright golden yellow color, so if I'm going to weave it in vertically, then it might show in this section, which is of a completely different color. What I'm going to do, I'm going to weave it in horizontally, like this, so that it will blend with the stitches of the same color. I'm cutting the yarn tail, leaving about 15-20 centimeters or 6 to 8 inches. And I will not weave in the whole yarn tail in one direction. Instead, I'm going to split it in 2 strands and weave them in 2 opposite directions. This way the yarn tail will become thinner and it will be much less visible. To make it easy, I first need to untwist the yarn tail as much as possible. So I'm checking here to see if it is completely straightened. Maybe a little bit more, something like this. I think this is good. And I will show it a little bit closer. It looks like the yarn is made of 2 strands and there is a little groove in between. That's the spot I need to split my yarn in 2. So I split it in 2 strands and just pull them apart slowly. And if the yarn tail was sufficiently untwisted, then it's very easy to split. So I need to untwist some more and try again. And the strands come apart very easily. And at the end here I have a little bit of fuzz left, so I will help it with the needle just to clean it up a little bit. Now I'm picking up one of the strands of my yarn tail and I'm going to determine which way I'm going to start weaving in. So if I hold the yarn tail like this, then it does not cross the stitch. And if I hold it like this, it appears that the yarn tail is crossing the stitch over. So I'm going to go this way. I don't want to cross the stitch. I will wrap the yarn tail in this direction, just around this stitch, and go back through the beginning of the stitch. So I'm going to wrap my yarn tail around this stitch. So I go under the both sides of the stitch above and pull the yarn tail through. And now I will return and pull the yarn through the beginning of the stitch. And it looks very nice, very neat. And on the other side I will repeat the same steps. This is my yarn tail, it's coming out of a stitch, and I will wrap it around this stitch again. Go under both sides of the stitch above it like that, and return again with my needle. Go through the beginning of the stitch. And continue. And if I am in between the columns, then I move the yarn tail to the beginning of the stitch, go under the 2 sides of the stitch above, and return through the beginning of the stitch. start at the beginning of the stitch, go under both sides of the stitch above, and here my yarn tail is very short, so I'm going to stick it through the beginning of the stitch backwards. I'm trying to show it better, so just like that. And now I can remove my tapestry needle. That's the yarn tail that I just worked with, and I will weave it in vertically now, and I'll use a hook. Again, I'm looking at the position of my yarn tail, and this way looks the most natural, so the yarn tail does not cross over any stitches. I'm taking my hook and push it under the side of the stitch and pull the yarn tail through, and continue so that the yarn tail follows the stitches. This is the last stitch before entering the new color, so I'm stopping right here, and this is the end. I will later just cut off the extra length of this yarn tail, and I will weave in the other half of the yarn tail in the opposite direction. This is the rib of the bottom of the sweater before washing, and this is after. And this is a cuff of a sleeve before washing, and this is after. So this step, washing and blocking, I would call the last but not the least important in achieving a very nice looking rib. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.